Welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you can join me for this last in a series of 3 webinars about privacy by design for the total learning architecture. This last webinar is specifically designed for training department managers who will be managing TLA-based environments within their organization. But again, even if you're not a training department manager, I hope you will have a good time listening to this presentation. So a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Bart Knijnenburg. I'm assistant professor in human-centered computing at Clemson University in the School of Computing. My research interests are usable privacy decision support and user-centric design and evaluation of adaptive systems. So I think that fits nicely within what I'm doing now for TLA and within this webinar. So I want to start with a disclaimer. This work has been supported by a DoD award for the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, but the views expressed in the webinar are my own, and they do not necessarily represent the views of ADL or the DoD. So the goal of this series of webinars is to inform TLA performers and people who will be involved with TLA about the aspects of TLA that impact users' privacy concerns. Now, since the TLA, the Total Learning Architecture, is still under development, we actually have a unique opportunity to develop it in a way that inherently takes privacy into account. Now, this is a philosophy that's called privacy by design, and this philosophy has been shown to be one of the best ways of alleviating users' privacy concerns. So we have a great opportunity to do privacy by design. And so in this webinar, I will make recommendations on how to build the total learning architecture and how to use the total learning architecture in a way that respects users' privacy inherently, so to say. Now, please note that the recommendations that I'm going to give are tentative and subject to continued discussion and revision. So this webinar is not only an opportunity for you to learn about privacy by design as it pertains to the total learning architecture, but also for you to provide feedback and to discuss some of these ideas. So to that effect, I have invited Dr. Erin Ash to be in the room with me, and she will be moderating any questions. So if you have any questions during the presentation or afterwards, you can ask them in 2 different ways. One is to raise your virtual hand in the GoToWebinar interface. And by doing that, Dr. Ash will inform me, interrupt me, and then unmute you so that you can ask the question. Or if you don't want to ask the question yourself, you can type it in the chat box, and she will read it and let me know and ask me the question. I am happy to be interrupted during the presentation, but if you have longer questions, please reserve them to the end. And if you want to have an even broader discussion, then we can take that offline as well. I am definitely available to talk. So before we start, I want to go through a couple of definitions. And probably most people on the line already know these definitions, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So first of all, the total learning architecture, I hope you've all heard of it. It's a set of specifications for creating a learning management system that integrates learning applications into personalized e-learning solutions. So it's the integration of multiple learning activities or learning applications, as well as the personalized aspects that makes privacy so important when talking about TLA. Privacy by design, as I mentioned, is a design philosophy in which privacy is addressed in the design of the system and the development of the system, rather than after the system has been developed. So we want to present today some ideas of how we think privacy can be put into the design of TLA right now, rather than once everything has been fixed. Operational characteristics. Now, this is a term that I use to refer to specific aspects of TLA that influence the user's experience. So when I refer to an operational characteristic, I refer to a specific aspect of the TLA that can be designed in one way or another. And what we're trying to do is build those operational characteristics in a way that kind of optimizes users' privacy without reducing any functionality of the system. So personally identifiable information, another term here is information that reveals a person's real-life identity. So when I talk about PII, that's what I mean. De-identification is the practice of removing any PII from a set of data. And pseudonymity is a means to identify a person in a system without revealing any links to their true identity outside the system. So for instance, a username, which is not necessarily linked to your real name, is a pseudonym that you can use in the system. So here are the topics that we're going to address today. So these are the operational characteristics that we're going to look at. And the first operational characteristic is the user of the system. So the user characteristics will be the first thing we look at. Now the user is obviously not under strict control of the system, but knowing how users make privacy decisions is actually very useful for developing privacy mechanisms and privacy decision support within TLA. So to that effect, we will review some research on how users make privacy decisions and give you some examples on how to best support users' privacy decision-making practices. Then we will consider the various aspects that need to be taken into account when we collect various types of data. So the TLA can collect a wide range of different types of data. What do we have to care about and worry about for each type of data that can be collected? Next, we will address ways to effectively present recommendations and adaptations while avoiding privacy problems. So as I mentioned, TLA envisions personalized learning experiences. And so those personalizations need to somehow be presented to the users in a way that is not invading on their privacy. Next, we'll discuss questions of data location and ownership and make some proposal regarding how personal data should be managed within the TLA system architecture. So who owns the data, who makes decisions about the data, etc. And then finally, we will talk a little bit about sharing data outside of the TLA. So the TLA obviously uses a lot of personal information in order to make this personalized learning experience, but that same data can also be used outside of TLA, for example, for inspecting your own learning behavior, for social sharing, for user research, or to make employment and placement decisions. So we will talk about the validity and the ethics and the privacy concerns regarding using data outside of the TLA. So as I mentioned, this is the last in a series of 3 webinars, and this particular webinar is developed for training department managers who will be managing the TLA-based environment within their own organization. But we recently, as recent as last week, had 2 other webinars, one for TLA backend developers and one for TLA activity providers or activity developers. And so the videos of those webinars and the slides will be online soon. And here's the address where you can find those resources. Hopefully by the end of this week, I'll have everything, including this presentation and these slides, up on this website. This is also the place where you can find the document on which this webinar or this series of webinars is based. So this webinar is based on our first privacy specification document for TLA. And this is a 100-page report that really goes in much more detail than what I can cover in a 1-hour presentation here. So I really encourage you to check that out, or even go to the website now and open it and follow along as I do the presentation. There's also a 10-page version if you don't want to dig into the 100-page version. And it has some general information about the project, and I'll make any information that I have available at that address. And as I mentioned before, I am really interested in having a further discussion about all of this. So you are also very much welcome to contact me at this email address and ask questions or start a discussion about some of the things that we talk about, either in the webinar today or in the document. So without further ado, let's start the webinar. So we will start with the operational characteristic of the user, so user characteristics. So privacy issues are an undying obstacle to the real-world implementation of learning systems, and especially a system like TLA that integrates multiple learning applications and is personalized. So while there exist several privacy-preserving technical solutions to personalizing and integrating information systems, the concept of privacy in itself is actually a human attitude towards the collection, distribution, and use of disclosed data. And even the disclosure itself is eventually a human behavior. Humans can decide not to disclose in many cases. So it's therefore very important to understand the research on how users of information systems like TLA make privacy decisions. And so we will review this research and give you some examples on how to support users' privacy decision-making practices in an intuitive and usable way. So as such, this section of the webinar is actually based on two sections of the specification document. Section 1 is actually about the user characteristics, and then section 6 is about privacy support mechanisms, but I've integrated them in this section of the webinar. So the user characteristics, the research on user characteristics can actually be summarized by two very broad findings. The first finding is that users are not categorically against disclosing their personal information. So if you have a system that provides some substantial benefits, then people are actually okay with disclosing their personal information. So what they actually do is they seek to balance the risks and benefits of disclosure. So they don't just focus on the risk, they don't just focus on the benefits, but they create a balance. And this is called the privacy calculus. So people make this decision actively. However, the second important research finding is that people are not always very good at making these privacy calculus decisions. So the calculus is not always very calculated. And because of that, circumstantial aspects like the default setting on a form or like the default privacy setting can actually have a very important influence on users' decisions. So it's important to think about these things when you're designing or deploying the system. So here's a graphical representation of the research on user privacy decision making. And so in the middle we have users' disclosure behavior, and you will see that when people do this privacy calculus, it's indeed a trade-off between the perceived risk and the perceived relevance of disclosing a specific piece of information. Now, the perceived risk is influenced by can actually be reduced by reducing users' privacy concerns. So if you can reduce the concerns that users have with your system by improving the privacy practices of your system, people will be more likely to disclose things because they perceive lower risk. However, it's not just what you do in the system, it's also about the trust that you have as an organization. So if users trust you more, then they will also perceive lower risks. So this is not something that can be changed from one day on the next. There's a legacy kind of trust going on there as well. Looking at perceived relevance, on the other hand, this is also an important aspect, and it can be improved by highlighting the potential benefits of disclosing information. So it's important that you talk about, okay, why are you collecting certain information? And that will help people overcome the risks because they perceive a reasonable amount of relevance. So that's the rational influences on decision making. But as I mentioned earlier, people are not always super rational in these decisions, and so there's also heuristic influences. One of these I already mentioned is the context, like whether a certain default setting is checked or unchecked. Another one can be the decision context as well. So, for instance, Facebook has many different privacy settings, but simply by having so many privacy settings, people tend to paradoxically actually disclose more information about themselves. So the context in which those settings are presented can actually influence people as well. And finally, affective influences can have an effect as well. So whether you present a certain disclosure as a loss of privacy or as a gain of certain benefits, that really influences how people make the decision as well. All right, so it's good to ask ourselves, why do users sometimes elaborate on their decision, so make rational decisions, and at other times the influences are much more heuristic? Because that seems to vary. Well, and the reason why this varies is explained by the elaboration likelihood model, which argues that people may at certain times be more or less likely to use either a central route of information processing, in which they are more influenced by heuristic influences, versus a peripheral route of processing, where they are more influenced by heuristic influences. So when we do central route processing, we really make an effort to understand the true risks and benefits of disclosure. So a good privacy protection mechanism in that case can really sway people who are in the central route to disclose their information more. So in this case, it's important to make the system more private, because if the system behaves trustworthy, people will be more likely to disclose if they're in the central route. However, if they're in the peripheral route, that's where these heuristic influences play an important role. And so there's things like superficial aspects, like any reputation of the website, or any privacy guarantees that are given by, for instance, a trustee logo or something like that, or even the design quality of the website that can influence people's disclosure. So while in the central route you need to focus on making the system behave trustworthy, if people are using the peripheral route, it's better to have a system that looks trustworthy. So eventually it's good to create a system that does both, right? That both behaves trustworthy and looks trustworthy. But in the end, it is also interesting to see if we can create a situation where people are encouraged to make more rational decisions, because that's kind of our gold standard, is to get people to really think about these disclosures. So is there anything that motivates people to either use the rational or either the central or the peripheral route? And it turns out that yes, users' perceived ability and perceived motivation for engaging in privacy decision making tends to increase their use of the central route. So there are various ways in which we can try to influence whether people use central route processing. So this is the kind of information privacy aspects of using the system. And so, as I mentioned, we need to help people by making the system look private, or look trustworthy, behave trustworthy, and maybe increase their motivation and perceived abilities so that they make more rational decisions. On the other hand, we also have users' social interactions. So the TLA-based systems are envisioned to have some social learning aspects in them as well. So certain applications, or maybe the TLA architecture itself, may have some social learning aspects to it. Now, and in this slide, it's important that different types of users tend to prefer different types of social interaction. So, for example, some of our research has shown that people who are what is called FYI communicators. They have this personality trait where they really like kind of passive, asynchronous, one-to-many communication. So they will be more inclined to use social networking functionalities that resemble Facebook or Twitter or location sharing services, where things are kind of passive. Whereas on the other hand, you also have what is called non-FYI communicators. So these are people that tend to like active, synchronous, and one-to-one communication. So they may like services like that resemble, for instance, WhatsApp or Skype or the regular old telephone, right? So it's important that you, if you implement social learning experiences, that you cater to both of these types of users. But even within a certain social network, different types of users tend to prefer different types of interaction. So, for example, we found that users of Facebook, we did some machine learning on their Facebook privacy management. And so it turns out that you can manage your privacy on Facebook in many different ways. They are represented around the circle here. But not every user engages in every type of privacy management behavior. And we found that when we do some clustering on this data, that we can actually detect 6 different privacy profiles. So there's specific ways in which people manage their privacy. So aside from privacy maximizers and minimalists and balancers who do just a lot of everything, a little bit of everything, and kind of anything in between, we find some interesting profiles such as selective sharers who tend to share a lot of information, but they carefully decide what to share with whom. So they need some functionality that allows them to do that, that allows them to selectively share with certain people but not with others. Like Google Plus's circles is a good example of that. On the other hand, we also found self-censors who tend to actually disclose to everyone kind of equally, but they limit the amount of disclosure. So they tend to just disclose much less. And so that should be an option as well. And then finally, we found an interesting group of users who tend to be more likely to consume information on social network, not post so much, but do a lot of consumption. And they tend to engage in privacy in a different way. They tend to be more likely to curate what information they receive on the social network. So they hide certain posts and block certain users in order to manage the amount of information that they take in. So all of these privacy management strategies need to be somehow supported within a social interaction functionality in a learning application. So in a previous section, we talked about how users' decisions to disclose their personal information kind of comes about and how we can support those decisions. But now we're going to talk about what kind of information are we talking about here. So the input data is the next operational characteristic that we're going to talk about. So how is the data disclosed or collected? And so we will talk about different data types here and how to deal with them. And more specific details about this aspect, about this operational characteristic, can be found in section 2 of the specification document, if you're following along. So it's important to note that privacy does not just relate to personally identifiable information. So it's not just your email address and your full name and your social security number that contain privacy-related information. Even when data is anonymized, there now exist mechanisms to re-identify the owner of the data. So, for example, Netflix had a data set, an anonymized data set of private Netflix viewing behavior that it made available to the research community. And some researchers were able to cross-reference this data with public IMDb viewing data. And some of those IMDb profiles actually had users' real names attached to them. And so by doing this cross-linking, they were able to detect those real people's private viewing experiences that were not listed in their IMDb profile, but that were listed in their Netflix profile. And so by doing this, they inadvertently outed a closeted gay mom who then sued Netflix, and that created all kinds of problems for the company. And similarly, people can be very easily re-identified using a subset of their friends' network. So if I know who your friends are, I can figure out who you are. And this kind of information is nowadays, for instance, used for credit score calculations. So your friend's credit score actually influences your own credit score. All a little bit problematic, and it can be even more problematic in the military, because if data can be de-anonymized or re-identified, then it can reveal the identities of special operatives or secret sites, or it can result in spear phishing or blackmailing. So it's important to make sure that data cannot be re-identified, because then if the data does become public, people cannot engage in these nefarious activities. So this means that systems really need to go beyond pseudonymity. It's not enough to just have a username that is not connected to the user's real name, because this data might be re-identified in one way or another. So the only way to get rid of the connection to the real person, to a certain real anonymity, is to use de-identification techniques like differential privacy or homomorphic encryption, which is certain that the data cannot be linked to the actual person. So that's about anonymity, but that said, within a system, pseudonymity can sometimes be useful even without talking about full anonymity. It's sometimes good not to use the user's real name, especially when you want to foster creativity and intimacy. So, for example, if you have a learner forum where people may ask maybe some humiliating questions, it might be better that it's not linked to their real name, so they will be more likely to ask those embarrassing questions and fear humiliation because of it. So it's good to foster creativity through pseudonymity. However, there are also situations where pseudonymity can have a negative effect. For instance, in more formal or diplomatic settings, for instance, when you're conducting a joint military training between two forces, in that case, you can use users' real identities to prevent fraud and anti-normative behavior. Research has shown that if you use people's real identities, those behaviors will decrease. So in a formal military setting, it may reduce unfair behavior or things like trash talk or things like that. So that might be a useful way to kind of keep people in check, so to say. So another important thing to talk about is that the TLA does not just involve conventional learning and training. The TLA is also envisioned to give users credit for experience that they've gained outside of a formal learning experience. So if I am reading an ebook or watching a documentary that is relevant for my job, I'm expected, within the TLA, I should be expected to gain credit for that. Now, this means that there's a fluid boundary between training and other activities. And so TLA may collect all sorts of data on the fly. So things like fitness tracking and, as I said, reading and watching behavior, maybe psychological well-being and financial health, like all that kind of data might be tracked by learning applications within the TLA. So it's important that each of these types of data has its own unique privacy implications. And unfortunately, this webinar is too short to go into detail on all of them, but I want to refer you to the document to learn more about them. But it's important to know that users should be able to consider their privacy setting for each of these different types of data separately. It's not just one type of data, but there's many different types that need to be taken into account. So one important aspect is that the TLA may track information that can help it make inferences about the user's learning performance. So this is data that is not just directly related to learning, but that can help them decide what to show you next, for instance. And those inferences should be treated with a lot of care, because people tend to hate it when these inferences are incorrect. So even if these are kind of inconsequential, they don't like it when the system assumes things about them that are untrue. So if the system makes a certain inference that could be wrong, it might be better to just ask the user for confirmation rather than to act upon it automatically. So it's better to have these things a little more manual, in a sense. And it turns out that even correct inferences can be problematic, because users may feel that those inferences can be a little creepy. And so one way to prevent this problem is to explain these inferences, and that may reduce their creepiness a little bit. But note that explanations themselves can also turn into kind of can have how do I say kind of persuasive aspects to it. So you need to be a little careful with that. Another problem with inferences is that they can create a potential for discrimination. So, for instance, it has been shown that women, on average, perform better on paper tests than on computerized tests. So, if you create inferences about a user's performance, about your user's performance based on computerized tests rather than based on paper tests, then you're discriminating against women, potentially. So you need to be very careful that those things can happen, and you need to guard against them as much as possible. So the best way to avoid unwanted inferences is to give users an active say in them. And so the best way to do that is to allow them to inspect and correct them. So Google, for example, allows users to see what topics they have inferred from your search and Gmail history and that they're using to give you targeted advertisement. So you can actually go into Google and see what Google knows about you, and you can correct that if there are many mistakes. So, for instance, if I like cats but not dogs, I can uncheck that box and correct Google's mistaken profile of me. So this is a way for users to gain a little bit of control over those inferences. All right, so now we've talked about how users deal with the data collection within TLA, but those data are obviously collected for a certain purpose, namely to provide personalized learning experiences. So to do this, the systems have to make some kind of on-the-fly recommendations and adaptations to the learning experience. And so these recommendations and adaptations themselves may actually sometimes bother the user. So this is privacy, not in the sense of information privacy, but in the sense of the right to be left alone and to deal with notifications, so to say. So in this section, we will address how to effectively present recommendations and adaptations in a way that avoids privacy problems. And more details about this can be found in section 3 of the specification document. So let me start by explaining that the TLA has 3 different types of adaptations. There's meta-adaptations, macro-adaptations, and micro-adaptations. So meta-adaptations are personalized recommendations on what learning activity the user should engage in next. So for instance, you should train your French. The macro-adaptations are recommendations of what to do within a certain learning activity. So for instance, you should work on your irregular verbs. And then finally, micro-adaptations are small adjustments to the activity based on the context. So for instance, if you're going to Montreal sometimes in the next month, then the language training app can add some local idiom to help you train for your upcoming trip. So this kind of shows that there are important potential benefits to adaptations, right? They reduce choice overload and information overload because they help users decide what to do next. And for application developers, it's actually good to have these adaptations because they create kind of a sustained relationship with the user. Netflix, for instance, considers its recommendation algorithm to be one of its biggest assets. So it's very important that those aspects are part of the system. On the other hand, adaptations tend to focus on users' current desires rather than their future goals. And for learning, obviously what is very important is users' future goals. So aspirations are very important. Another problem is filter bubbles, in that when we give users learning recommendations based on their presumed preferences, they may feel like they're limited to the set of things that are recommended by the system, rather than being able to venture outside this. So users may also become, because of this, they may become overly dependent on the TLA, and they may feel like they're no longer playing an active role in deciding what to learn. So it's important not to overdo it when it comes to these adaptations, and to give users an active role. So finally, in this section, we're going to talk about how are these recommendations really presented, right? So one way for users to receive recommendations is on a personal device. And when you're using a personal device, especially something like a smartphone or smartwatch, you have to make sure that the recommendations are carefully timed and don't interrupt the user's current task. So some kind of smart silent or do not disturb mode can really avoid intruding upon the user's privacy. And Apple recently introduced for iOS 11 a functionality where you're no longer disturbed while you're driving. So it actually detects when you're driving and it's not going to give you any notifications then. So that's something like that would be very useful for learning recommendations as well. Because if I'm busy, you don't need to give me learning recommendations. On the other hand, when we think about public devices or larger displays in public areas, we have to think about not showing recommendations or at least certain types of recommendations when there are any bystanders. Because if there are bystanders, the system through the recommendations might leak some classified learning activities or personal or embarrassing information. So you have to be careful about that when you're presenting recommendations on a large computer screen or, for instance, a television. So now we're going to talk about the data and where it resides. So TLA-based systems collect, generate, and store all this data, but where does it go? And who owns this data? So we will make a proposal regarding how personal data should be managed within the TLA system architecture and who should be involved in the management of that information. So more details on this can be found in section 4 of the specification document, if you're following along. So TLA has these 3 components that are relevant to the collection and storage and processing of personal information. There's the TLA data core, which collects the information, the processors that use the information to provide adaptations, and then user-facing applications, which are the interface with the user, so they collect the information and they actually present the adaptations to the user. So the first question that one may ask is, where should the central components of a TLA architecture or TLA instance, where should those components actually reside? Should there be one TLA for the entire army, or maybe one per division or one per department? So this is an interesting problem where ideally, the architecture should be controlled by an entity that is actually trusted by all of its members. So if you're going to too high of a level, people may not trust the entity that is, like if there's one for the entire army, that may result in some trust issues. So ideally, maybe something like one per training department would be good. But on the other hand, if you make a lot of different instances of TLA, that makes it harder to allow for mobility between different departments, right? If I'm moving from one department to another, the data should be available to that other department as well. So if you make the TLA instances too small, you get kind of data silos. So we should make sure that that doesn't happen. So the goal here is to find kind of the optimal level to implement TLA. And it needs to be low enough to generate trust, but high enough to avoid any mobility problems. And I currently don't have a perfect solution to this, but we're still working on that, and I would love your input on this as well. So given the different approaches to adaptation that I discussed earlier, it's also interesting to find out where all of the components, which of the components should be responsible for which type of adaptation. So, for instance, we believe that the TLA processor should be responsible for meta-adaptations. And the reason for that is that meta-adaptations require knowledge of the user's kind of integrated learner profile to decide what they should learn next. So it's best if that's done by a more centralized entity like the TLA processors. Now, the processors could also do the macro adaptation, so the high-level adaptations within an application, but the applications themselves may have kind of specific internal and maybe even proprietary logic for actually making those adaptations. So this might be better. This task may be better given to the applications themselves. And then finally, there are these micro adaptations. We believe that those might be better done client side. So I do not want to actually collect any learner runtime data or very low-level contextual data, because that data can be very sensitive, and so it's better to actually leave that data on the device and actually do the adaptations there. And our current devices are definitely powerful enough to provide at least some of those adaptations on the fly without having to send any data to a server. So that results in an architecture that looks a little bit more like this. And so one thing that I think is important is to use context data primarily client-side and maybe remove it from the data core altogether, or only store it in aggregate form so that that data does not contain any very sensitive information. Finally, I'm also advocating some kind of access control mechanism whereby apps cannot access the learner profile in an unfettered way, and where users actually have control over which applications can access which type of data. Now, I realize that this would result in some kind of privacy settings mechanism, and so developing more usable ways of providing that mechanism, for example, through user-tailored privacy, is something that we're working on right now, and we will hopefully have a webinar on that topic in the future. So now we're going to talk about ownership. So when a TLA user does a training for their job, the training provider, the employer, and the user themselves all become kind of stakeholders in the collected data. So it's important to find out who is actually the owner of that data and who gets to say something about that data. So we need to deal with this idea of shared ownership. Moreover, users may not have time to actively be involved in the management of their personal data. So even if they are the final owner of the data, they may not have time to really make very detailed decisions about it. So because of that, we introduced this concept of data stewardship, where some other entity, for instance, a training department manager, can actually be managing the data on the user's behalf. And then finally, users may move between different instantiations of the TLA, kind of depending on at what level it's implemented. And so the system should provide some support for data mobility. So we'll talk about each of these topics a little bit. So generally speaking, this problem can be solved by kind of structuring data ownership like 401k. So the user formally owns the data, and the employer can manage and contribute to the data on the user's behalf and use it for their own purposes as well. And then the data can actually move with the user if they're going to a different organization with their own TLA. So this means that user models will need to be portable. So when a user moves from her first employer to a second one, some data should be transferred to the second employer. And I'm saying some data because some of that data may have to remain hidden. For instance, if there is confidential data, if the user moves from military to civilian, some of the training data may involve some confidential information. Also, the user themselves may want to not transfer some of their learning data to their new employer, like their failed grades or something like that. So this should be something where the user and the employer together can create a subset of data that can move. Obviously, the first employer can still access the data of the user while they are when they are gone, but obviously no new data from the user will be contributed to the data that is accessible by the first employer anymore. But it's important for this employer to still have access to this data, for instance, for research purposes or to write recommendation letters or things like that. So, as I mentioned earlier, users may not have time to actively be involved in the management of their personal data. And so if they have to decide which type of application can access which type of data, that's a lot of work. And on Facebook, it's already very difficult to manage your privacy. Can you imagine something as complex as the total learning architecture? So users may not be the best suitable entity to actually do all of this, to put the burden fully on the user. That's not a good idea. So therefore, we introduced the idea of data stewardship, where, for instance, a training department manager can manage the data on the user's behalf. So the idea is that the data steward would set up the TLA system with all the learning applications and kind of share data with the different TLA-based learning applications as they deem appropriate. However, users may, of course, tweak these settings later on if they are not agreeing with it. And for sensitive or classified data, the TLA may embrace some kind of mechanism where both parties need to agree before the data can be shared with the application. But in other cases, the steward may be given full control, and in other cases, you even want to give the user full control. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism to decide this is what the user can control, this is what the steward can control, and for these they both need to for these things they both need to agree. I think it's important when you set up such a stewardship to have a strict and transparent policy for what the stewards will be doing with the user's data. So it's important to keep individual users' control preferences in mind. So there may not be a single policy, but multiple policies for different types of users. And those practices should be allowed, those practices should be outlined in a way that says, okay, this should be always allowed, this should be never allowed. And this data should require explicit consent either as opt-out or in most cases better an opt-in kind of mechanism where the user is asked for final permission. All right. So finally, we're going to talk about data sharing. So the final part of this webinar talks about how the data collected by TLA can actually be shared outside of the TLA, but inside the organization. So this includes things like user research, social learning, users inspecting their own data, and things like employment and deployment decisions. Oh, and this is section 5 of the specification document. So when it comes to data sharing, users themselves are kind of the first and foremost beneficiary of having access to that data. So I think it's important not to just use that data within the TLA, but also to give users access to that data. And so this is called scrutability. And so presenting users with their own data can, especially if you do it in an understandable and usable way, it can really increase their trust and understanding of what the system is doing. But it can also create some kind of a powerful quantified self-experience. So users can explore the data and find out where their learning is actually very effective and where they need to make improvements. So this really helps users in taking ownership of their own learning experience. Next up, there's an opportunity through social learning to share data with other users of the TLA. And research has shown that learning together and sharing your learning experience can actually improve learning performance. But it can also lead to privacy problems. So since learning is a relatively private experience, I believe that social learning applications should not just simply share learning outcomes with users, with all of the users' contacts, but they should allow users to selectively decide with whom to share. So the application can even help with this selection and suggest sharing and learning experiences with friends that have a similar performance or a similar learning trajectory. So you can actively help users in selecting with whom to share the data. And this is also a nice way to, for instance, pair people who have similar communication styles. So put people who have an FYI communication style together and people who have a non-FYI communication style together. So one useful trick to pair users, so for instance, if you want to have paired learning, is to leverage findings from social psychology research. So researchers have found that some people perform better if they compare themselves against people who perform better than them. So this is called upward social comparison. Whereas others perform better if they compare themselves against people who perform worse than them. That's downward social comparison. So if a system can find out whether someone is an upward or downward social comparator, they can actually pair people together who are, one is an upward, one is a downward social comparator, and one is a little bit ahead. So that creates a better social dynamic, so to say. So that's another adaptive way of supporting social learning. So when you're sharing data between users, it is important to keep federal laws into mind, because, for instance, when you're sharing official learning data, this might be linked to, for instance, this might fall under the FERPA jurisdiction, which basically means that you're not allowed to share educational outcome data without the user's explicit consent. So then you have to be careful in actually asking consent before you do anything. Another typical aspect of social learning is the idea of peer assessment. So that's another aspect where privacy comes into play, because feedback from peers can definitely motivate performance, but overly extensive review procedures can actually be counterproductive. So one thing that you can think about is, do you want feedback to be anonymous or non-anonymous, right? So in peer reviews, anonymous reviews tend to be more honest, but they can also be more harsh. And so if you have secret and snide comments, that can actually create a negative atmosphere. So a good way to overcome this problem is to foster discussion and to really allow users to reply to their peer evaluations in a more formal manner, so that you don't get any insider struggles, so to say. So finally, in this section, I want to talk about the idea that data can, within the TLA, can be used for research and to decide on promotions and to plan missions, right? You can use the data to decide who is well suited for a promotion or something like that. So the secondary use of data may not be expected by the users, and because of that, you have to be very careful and communicate very carefully how you're going to use that data. And one way to do this is through informed consent process. The other thing you can do is some kind of IRB review procedure. Now, if you're, for instance, if you're using data for mission planning decisions, users may insist that their data does not completely represent them, and that those kind of decisions should actually be made on a more holistic level. So by really being open and communicating with users, you can prevent such problems. For certain types of practices, it's really better to require users to explicitly opt in rather than to allow them to opt out of these kind of practices. And finally, administrators should definitely give users a say in the development of these procedures and how those data are used outside of the TLA system itself. All right, so that concludes the last section of our webinar. Let's now review what we've learned here. So in this webinar and in this series of webinars, I have provided some recommendations that will allow ADL and other TLA performers and the training department managers and people who are building learning applications to select the operational characteristics that best alleviate users' privacy concerns and to develop those operational characteristics in a way that avoids privacy problems from happening. Now, unfortunately, I've only been able to give you a brief overview, so I really encourage you all to read the specification document, where you will find much more details about each of the recommendations that I talked about. As I mentioned all the way in the beginning, these recommendations are still tentative, so please read the specification document, or at least part of it, and let me know what you think. I really want to foster a continued discussion about these issues as we move forward, and eventually I'll come knocking on your door and ask you for your opinion. So with that said, I want to just give a very general overview of what we talked about. Our recommendations covered how to best support users' privacy decision practices, what considerations need to be made regarding the collection of various types of data, how to effectively present recommendations and adaptations to avoid privacy problems, how personal data should be managed within the TLA system architecture, and finally, how data can be shared between people involved in the TLA outside of the TLA system in a responsible manner. So again, if you're interested in learning more, here's the link to the website with all the information, and feel free to contact me. Thanks everyone for listening, and we will now open the floor for a few questions, if there are any. So feel free to raise your hand or type the question in the chat if you have a question or you want to ask something. Yes, anyone? Don't be shy. Anyone have any questions? No questions? Well, the hour is about up. So, well, if there aren't any questions, then again, feel free to contact me at my email address if you do have any questions. And yeah, if you are involved with TLA, please shoot me an email, and I'm really looking forward to working with you in the future to improve our specification document and to really make privacy work for TLA. We're here to help you and to support you however we can. So again, thanks everyone for listening.